I just wanted to record some thoughts on opening the churches and the responses that some people have had, and try and think of, to do some theological reflection and try and think of what Scripture has to say. The key response has to be that old phrase, what would Jesus do? And there seem to be three sets of Scripture that talk to this situation. I'll start with the Good Samaritan. When the Good Samaritan met and found the man on the road to Jericho, he stopped, he bound up his wounds, put the man on his donkey, took him to an inn and made sure that he was looked after, and then on his way back again made sure that the man was being looked after and provided for. Some people have questioned whether we even need to put sanitizers in trusting other individuals' sensibilities. Other people have said, well, we just leave sanitizers in and trust that people will use it. What the story of the Good Samaritan says to me is that we need to go the full distance. It would have been quite easy for the Samaritan to have seen the man by the road, taken the equivalent of his first aid kit off his donkey, given it to the guy and said, well, if you want to use it, use it. But that's not what he did. He stopped. He tended to the wounds, he bandaged the man up and took him. And that seems to suggest that we have a responsibility to go that step beyond. So just leaving sanitizers and assuming that people will do as they're asked is not enough. That's not what Jesus would expect. Another passage that comes to mind is the feeding of the 5,000, where all those people gathered, they followed Jesus, and they were hungry. They weren't sure how long Jesus was going to talk for. They weren't sure how far they were going to travel. And they didn't have enough food with them. And the disciples said, Jesus, Lord, these people are hungry. What should we do? And Jesus said, sort it out. You, as disciples, sort it out. Now, people are going to come to our churches. They may not have sanitizer with them. They're going to come in. They may decide not to use the sanitizer. Jesus says, you sort it out. You take care of it. You provide. So it's not enough, surely, for us just to leave signs. just to leave some sanitizer out. We've got to have some way of making sure. It also means that we've got to make sure that the building is safe for people. And that means cleaning it and preparing it for people. The disciples had to organize the 5,000 or however many there actually were, organize them, get the food out to them. And that, in a sense, is what we need to do. And the other passage that comes to mind is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Again, he could have just put a bowl of water out and said, "Been a long walk, mate. Feet a bit dusty. I suggest you go and wash your feet." But he didn't. He wrapped a towel around himself and he washed the disciples' feet. And says, "As I have come as a servant, so I am sending you to be a servant." We have a duty of care to show Christian love, to be Christ-like, to go that step beyond. And if we are unable to, because a large percentage of us are having to self-isolate, are in a vulnerable group, then we cannot leave our churches open all the time. And we have to think of other ways of having the church open. Some churches have felt that they cannot respond. They haven't got the personnel and have quite rightly taken the decision not to open. Others have said what we can do is to open for an hour and a half, one day a week. That seems to be the sensible way, I think. What would Jesus do? Jesus would not just say, "Well, we leave it all open and just trust." He would demand of us to go steps beyond, to ensure that people were safe, to ensure that there was not a risk, or that risks were as far as possible eliminated. It is deeply saddening to read some responses, to hear some responses. We have to be a Christian community. We have to be Christ-like. We have to look to what Jesus would do. And those three scriptures just speak to me. The Good Samaritan, he went the extra mile. He put himself out to ensure that that man was safe and healed. feeding of the 5,000, Jesus said, look, it is our responsibility. It's not their fault that they have come without food. It is our responsibility. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he said, I am a servant. You are called to be servants. And that's the framework that we need to be thinking in. Yes, we've got the government guidelines, we've got all the guidelines from our bishops. But the key question has to be, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus expect us to do in showing his love, his care? God gave us a set of guidelines in the Old Testament and hoped that at that point he thought, that's okay, I've given them guidelines. We failed to follow those. And so he had to come himself and intervene in the person of Jesus. And he set us that example that we have to go and intervene. We have to take the position of responsibility for other people. God expects us to take the responsibility. That's the framework.